We finished up looking at the book of Ruth last week, and I heard from so many people, like I got an excessive amount of feedback, which is good, that apparently everyone loves the story of Ruth. You can't go wrong with it, and it was great, and there was a lot of interesting things to talk about there. And to be honest, I wasn't 100% sure of where to go next, but out of a few different discussions, thought that we would try and take a look at the book of Esther. So a little bit of a theme. There are two books in the Bible that are named after ladies, and they both have, they are both stories, narrative retellings of some historical events in the nation of Israel. And so in some ways they're parallel, in some ways they're very, very different. But we'll see how this goes. The few people that I mentioned that we were looking at Esther, they seemed jazzed, so we'll see. It had been a little while since I'd read Esther. I mean, I've read it. Looking at it again, it's like, oh, there's some nuance here. There'll be some things to talk about. But I thought as we get ready to dive in, as I often do, I want to set a little bit of context for us. I know there are some of you here where you're like, I could teach you about when this was written and what the setting is and where it fits into the big picture. But just to kind of get us on a similar page, I want to try to set a little bit of background. So Esther is a book in your Old Testament. You can turn there if you've got a Bible, Esther chapter 1. We're going to be looking at it. And so this is a story that is set in Persia, which is now called Iran. And but at the time of this story, it was set in Persia. The Persian Empire was like a big deal historically. It was founded around 560 BC by King Cyrus the Great, and he defeated Babylon. Babylon was the big dog up until that point. He defeated Babylon and he established Persia as the new superpower in the ancient Near East. And Cyrus is also the king who decreed that the Jewish people who had been carried into exile by Babylon years before, under the rule of King Nebuchadnezzar, he came, laid siege to Jerusalem, destroyed it, destroyed the temple, carried off almost everybody to Babylon. Now, Babylon's under new management, and King Cyrus declares that all of the Jewish people who would like, they can go back to Israel and to rebuild the temple. And you can read about this in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which come just before Esther in our English Old Testaments. And it tells that story. Now, many of the Jewish people had returned to Israel, but not all of them. Many of them had remained behind in Babylon/Persia, including the heroes of this story when we look at the book of Esther. So Esther's story takes place probably between around 483 and 478 BC. So people who are into dates, maybe you're like, yep, I'm right with you on the timeline. The rest of us are like, hold on, these count backwards, right? How does that work? And it happens during the reign of, in the ESV, it gives his Hebrew name as Ahasuerus or Ahasuerus. I have never heard it pronounced the same way twice. Fortunately, this guy is better known by his Greek name, Xerxes I. Xerxes the First, the son of Darius, the grandson of King Cyrus. Xerxes is well known. He's maybe best known as the Persian king who attacked Greece, and he fought King Leonidas of Sparta in the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC. I think there was some comic books and movies about it. I don't know if it went exactly like that, but it was a big deal. The book of Esther begins just before that campaign, actually, and most of it happens just after Xerxes returns from his ultimately unsuccessful European adventure. The book of Esther is a beautiful story. It's another great woman of the Bible, well loved by many. This book, this story is especially popular amongst Jewish people, even to this day, as it tells the origin of the festival of Purim, which is coming up. And we're going to actually, the end of the book will coincide pretty close on the calendar, just as a fun coincidence. So it's great, it's well loved, it's popular. We love Esther. Upon closer examination, though, just full disclosure, the book of Esther can be concerning. Whereas Ruth is pretty much what you see is what you get, and you can go through it, and it's just fantastic. There are some issues, some concerns with the book of Esther. One of them is the historicity of the events. It is set in a very specific time and place. Dates are given. It mentions people and places that we have that can be corroborated through other historical sources, and then there are some questions. The main one concerns the identity of King Xerxes' queen. The book of Esther, as we're going to read, records that he was married to a woman named Vashti, and then later Esther comes on the scene. There is no record outside of the book of Esther of Vashti or Esther. Persian history records no mention of them. There are records. There is mention of King Xerxes having married a woman named Amestris, and some records exist of what sort of queen she was, but there's no record of her being disposed or replaced or anything like that. Now, when you have a situation like this, it is what is sometimes called an argument from silence. We don't have other records of it, therefore maybe it didn't happen. Arguments from silence are not conclusive, but in a context like this, when we're talking about, say, the history of the Persian Empire, when there are actually a lot of other historical records, a big thing mentioned in one source, not mentioned in the others, is at least something to make us ask questions, and people have debated this question for literally centuries. So there's a historicity problem. It bugs some people, not others. There's also the fact that when we actually read this story, and we're going to over the next few weeks, it's full of morally questionable characters. Even the heroes in this story are not unambiguously upright. Like when we read the book of Ruth, it doesn't say, now Ruth was beautiful and smart and witty and funny and she did no wrong. Right? It doesn't say that. But her character, by and large, everything that's revealed about her is like she is brave and loyal and self-sacrificing. And Boaz is like noble and godly and kind, and he takes his responsibility seriously and he does things the right way. Right? Esther's different. Right? It's not like here are the good guys and the bad guys. There's good guys and bad guys, but there's morally questionable characters. And then the other and maybe most well-known concern about the book of Esther is that it does not mention God at all. God's name is not mentioned, not like we mentioned in Ruth, that the narrator of Ruth never says, now God did this or God said this. But the characters in the book of Ruth were constantly praying to God or declaring that God has done this or this thing that happened was God's doing. He's not mentioned at all in the book of Esther. And this, you can go back into even like they would be considered Old Testament period, but the Jewish scholars and rabbis debated about this, and all through Christian church history. It's like, how do we understand this? Is this a big problem? Some people say, yeah, this is essentially a secular book. Others are like, no, when you read it, you can see the hand of God all through it. And perhaps the fact that he's not mentioned explicitly is an important theme, which I think we're going to uncover that. But we need to be aware that there are some concerns. But our lives are like that, aren't they? Our lives are full of unlikely events, morally questionable characters, right? Seemingly random occurrences. God, in our own stories, often works in ways that we wouldn't be able to predict, and he doesn't often actually sign his name to stuff, does he? Things happen, and depending on our faith perspective, we could be like, that was so clearly God. Was a God moment. We saw God's hand at work. We'll say things like that legitimately, but it's not like we have some kind of like divine email from God. You know, you open your inbox, oh, what's this? That was me, God, right? Like, oh, there you go, right? We don't get that. So does that mean that our stories are secular, not sacred? Does that mean that God is not actually present in our stories? I think Esther shows us that God is always working in our stories. Whether we see it or not, whether we want to see it or not, whether we choose to see it or not. And I think that is a good lens to look through as we approach this book. So, again, this, similar to Ruth, Esther is a narrative. And so, on one hand, anytime you break it up, the flow of the story stops. On the other hand, I don't want to drown in the details. Some of you might be like, really? I think you do. I think you'll like it. You'd be right. But I know we need to be able to keep moving so that we don't lose sight of the forest as we examine every blade of grass that we see. So I'm going to take some bigger bites on some of these weeks. And this week I'm going to be covering all of chapter 1 and most of chapter 2, because it really is the fast-moving introduction. This story follows very, very clearly, similar to Ruth. Like if you remember your English class, or if you teach English or any of these things, you'll very clearly see like there's the setting, and then things get bad for the heroes, and then there's a pivot, and then it comes back up, and there's some symmetry between the two sides. It's certainly really well crafted, and so the stuff in the intro sets context. It's not, I don't think we have to camp there, but we have to know what's going on. So instead of reading the whole thing, I am going to read it in the sections that I mentioned in your notes, but I don't think I'm going to butcher the story too much. So it begins with some setting. It says, now in the days of Ahasuerus, and I'm reading out of the ESV, I'm just going to let you know, I'm going to say Xerxes, because that I can pronounce, and we're just going to go. It's the same guy. I'm not messing with scripture. This is just the Hebrew. Anyway. Now in the days of Xerxes, the Xerxes who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days, when King Xerxes sat on his royal throne in Susa, in the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple, cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict: there is no compulsion. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Xerxes. I want to pause there. The book gives us a little bit of historical setting, and it opens with a massive party. For those who like history and fitting things into a timeline, it says that this happened. It's making sure we know which Xerxes we're talking about, which is important after the fact, because he had a son named Artaxerxes, and then there was another Artaxerxes, then there was Xerxes II, and you know how these royals get sometimes, right? So it's like this one, the guy who reigned at the time, a territory that stretched like from India to Kush, which is like south of Egypt. They controlled Egypt at the time too. It was like everything that we would describe as the Middle East, you know, from the south coast up to like Turkey, all across there, right? So it's like that guy and where he lived. And it says it was in the 3rd year of his reign that he gave this feast. So we know from other records that when King Xerxes took over from his father, King Darius, almost immediately he had to go and deal with a pretty significant uprising. There was a rebellion in Egypt. And so sort of first order of business was go and deal with that. There were some big plans for an invasion of Greece. There were some big building projects that Darius had wanted, but first thing Xerxes had to do was go and deal with these uppity people in Egypt, and apparently he did so quite definitely and with great success, although there was costs to his military. And so then he returned, and we know that he was spending some time rebuilding his military and gaining support, looking forward to this campaign in Europe. So this banquet is right after he gets back from Egypt, and this kind of fits. So he shows off all of his greatness in this 6-month banquet. Now, as awesome as it would be to imagine a non-stop 6-month, like a casino, it just doesn't stop, right? Lights and liquor and dancing and music, and it's just for 6 solid months. Very likely, maybe not quite to that level. It was because it says he had all of his military leaders and all the governors and stuff. I very much doubt that he pulled all of the military and government, paused it for 6 months after just dealing with an uprising, and said, let's just get totally snockered for like half a year. What could go wrong, right? Very likely people were invited in sort of waves. You know who was there the whole time, though? Xerxes. He loved, at least in this book, he clearly loves partying, and if he can have a drink in his hand, that is all the better, that we're going to kind of see as we read this book. So he's doing this, he's showing off, and it says the theme was the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness. So this was not, check out how humble I am. Look how real, like I'm a man of the people. That was not the theme. It was like, I am the total best. So it's this big party. And so that is kind of this, sets the scene. Then we move into this next little section where we meet the next character. We meet Queen Vashti. Well, I mentioned Queen Vashti. She's also giving a feast for the women in the palace. Jumping in, looking at verses 10 to 22. It says, on the 7th day, so at the end of the kind of party for everyone in the city, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Xerxes, to bring Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. And at this the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure towards all who were versed in law and judgment, the men next to him being Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom. He asked them, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she has not performed the command of King Xerxes delivered by the eunuchs? Then Memucan said, in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she didn't come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same thing to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Xerxes. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed through all the kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man must be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. All right, let's pause there. So the king has been 6 months and a week. The theme is, look how awesome I am. And he was merry with wine. Okay, so the decisions he's making are, he's looking through his beer goggles, and he says, you know what else is awesome? My wife. She is so pretty. And he's like, we should bring her in here. I just want you all to see that she is the prettiest. Go get her. Bring her in here. Now, we don't know how exactly the conversation went. We don't know what she was in the middle of, but we know that he sent his servants and said, the king wants you to come like now and put on your fancy hat. And she said no. So this was embarrassing, right? He's been 6 months establishing that he is like the biggest king ever, right? And his own wife is like, no, I'm busy. I'm doing a thing. Like, could we, right? And so he reacts. He's embarrassed and he's upset, and he consults his wise men. What should be done, right? How do I say that? It's in my notes all through here. Like, keep pedaling. Don't. So you've got a drunk guy that's no one tells him no. He's got like unlimited executive power. To his credit, in his anger, he's like, I should get some advice. Who should I ask? The 7 other drunk guys that help me run the country. Surely, if there's a blind spot in my thinking, these guys will find it. And they get together, and it's like, you know what? This is bad. They're thinking, I know it's like, this is going to be bad for me personally. So he's like, we need to stomp this hard. So this rule goes out, and at the end of the day, Vashti is deposed as queen, and this law goes out that says every man must be master in his own household, and the ESV says, and speak according to the language of his people. Apparently it's translating a figure of speech that smarter guys than me say. It sort of means he should be able to speak, like tell his wife the way it's going to be. Every man should get the last word. Kind of, right? So clearly written by men, probably married to women who are not stupid, and they've had something to drink, and they're like, we just would like, this is a great chance to just smooth things out for us. I think it was probably short-term thinking, but again, what could go wrong, right? They're all just partying and doing these things. But at the end of the day, the queen is deposed. We don't know what happened to her. As I say, there's no other historical records of Vashti at all, and the book doesn't say, some suggest, well, if she a deposed queen, she was probably executed. Some are like, well, no, she was probably put in a house somewhere and just kind of lived quietly for the rest of it. We don't know. But then we move into chapter 2, into the big section here when we start to meet the main characters. It says, after these things, looking at chapter 2, verse 1, after these things, when the anger of King Xerxes had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young women to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. And let their cosmetics be given to them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. And this pleased the king, and he did so. That's a shocker, eh? Oh, I miss my queen. It's the young men. What are they going to suggest? Just get a bunch of beautiful girls in here and pick one. Like, this is very sound dude thinking. He's like, let's do it. It pleased the king. Okay, so now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father or mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now, when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Xerxes, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period for their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Xerxes into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a grand feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. So the plot has moved very quickly. We get a little clue here. It says that Esther went into the palace in the 7th year of his reign. So very likely what has happened between the first part, when we learned about Vashti, and this second part is the king holds that big party. Vashti does not come when called, so she's fired. Shortly thereafter, King Xerxes leads his army up into Greece, fights King Leonidas and the Spartans, beats them, but then makes some other dumb moves, loses a lot of his navy, and ends up coming home. That is what happened in between. His missing Vashti, likely he comes home and it's like he thought about what he had done, and the let's hold a beauty contest, that happens after that first part. So there's been a gap. That was in his 3rd year, now we're in his 7th year, and he calls this beauty contest, essentially. So he returns, and his attendants make this great suggestion, right? Pick a new queen, and have options. You're the king. Like, just get all of the beautiful young women. And that is just such a dude suggestion, right? And so he does this thing, and there's a lot of discussion about what this looked like, right? I think the consensus is this was not presented like, American Idol, where it's like, do you think you have what it takes? Sign up. And they're like lining up in droves. I'm pretty and trying to make the cut. You're going to Susa kind of thing. Maybe. The fact that it says he appointed officials to gather in these beauties suggests that it maybe wasn't something people volunteered for. But we don't read of the people resisting either. We don't know. I'm not a beautiful young maiden. I have daughters, though, so I try. Naturally, I'm like, what would that be like? I wouldn't be in favor, right? But there's a possibility in that time, right? The qualifications for the girls to go is just that they are young and beautiful. You don't have to be a noble. You don't have to be wealthy. And so, like, if your daughter went and actually became queen, that would be like winning the lottery. So maybe, it wasn't all bad. Maybe, just like the lottery, they didn't think about the odds or the cost of losing. We just don't know. But we are introduced to one of the main characters, arguably the main character of the book, Mordecai. It says he's Jewish, from the tribe of Benjamin. Given the names of his relatives, he is possibly a descendant of King Saul's line. The King Saul, who was the first king of Israel, who was displaced by David because he was a bit of a doughhead sometimes. That guy. We don't know a ton about Mordecai. He was, as several scholars that I read, he was possibly a eunuch himself. Eunuchs get mentioned a lot in this story. If you're not sure what that is, Google the term. This is going online, and I'm not going to explain that one to you. Just because there was no mention of Mordecai having a wife or kids, so that's, we wonder. And he seems to have a position in the palace that allows him close access to where the women were. And so, like kings, and Xerxes didn't invent this, you only let eunuchs work in that area. Again, I think there's some obvious logic that I don't need to explain, but we don't know. So we meet Mordecai, and then we meet Esther, whose Esther means star in Persian, which is great. It gives her Jewish name, which means myrtle, which is a plant. But to me, that's such a grandma name that I got to be honest, as I was studying this book, every time I looked at the name Esther, I was saying myrtle in my mind. That's hilarious. That's free. I'm not going to do that as we read and preach. But star is maybe better than myrtle. So we meet Esther, and what do we know? She's lovely, beautiful. She's got a great face and a great figure, and she's very pretty. So it's like, well, she seems to be exactly who they're looking for. And she is taken to the palace, right? It doesn't say she went, she climbed the fence, she butted in line. She was taken to the palace with many others. They're all beautiful girls, right? And Mordecai very clearly, and it doesn't explain why, but he told her to keep her heritage a secret, right? If they ask you questions, if there's an intake interview about who are your people and where you're from, don't tell them that you are of Jewish descent. And it says that she did that. She listens to Mordecai, who raised her. He was the only father that she had. And it says that she immediately gained favor, right? She goes in, and the guy who's overseeing this whole area, this he guy, it just says that like she caught his eye, she found favor with him, and he immediately started giving her what looks like a little bit of a competitive advantage, right? They're all going in, and they're all going to be, given beauty treatments and stuff, but she's like given the best spot, and she's given maids and stuff. Why did she earn his favor? How did that happen? We don't know. It's one of the mysteries of this book. One of the themes that we see are things like this happen. We mentioned this in Ruth, right? Because there was a section where it's, it just so happened. It just so happened that this Jewish girl she seems to be the one that he guy is cheering for anyway. What do we know about her? Well, we know she was beautiful. Maybe it was her beauty, except they're all beautiful. That was the point. The only other thing we know is that she's Jewish, but no one there knew that. Mordecai's instruction to keep it a secret suggests that if they knew, it would not help her chances, right? This would not make her more popular, so he's like, just keep that on the down low. And yet, here we are. This Jewish girl seems to be the front runner. So they get taken in, and we're given a little bit of a peek behind the scenes of how the harem industry works. Again, this is descriptive, not prescriptive, okay? Don't say it's in the Bible, so I'm going to get a harem and I'm going to don't do these things. They're given beauty treatments for a year. A year! Like, how long do your girls take to get ready for a big date? Like, I understand it's a big date, but a year? Like, how rough were these girls looking to begin with? Like, or was the king that cheated? We don't know, right? It's excessive. King Xerxes, it's just go big or go home, right? So a year of getting ready. And we get a little bit of the rules, right? And it's semi-icky. But they can wear whatever they want, bring whatever they want, ornaments, jewelry, whatever, maybe snacks. They look their best. And then when their time comes, they're off to the palace for an overnight job interview. And then it's like you're into the hiring pool. Don't call us, we'll call you, right? But they very clearly move from the residence of the women into the residence for the concubines. Pretty clearly, they don't just get to go home. They are the king's concubines. You can Google that term as well if you want. What was life like in the harem? We don't know, right? On the one hand, this seems horrible to us. The concubines were almost prisoners. They certainly had very limited freedom. On the other hand, was it perhaps a pretty cushy government job? On call all the time, but generally not a lot of responsibility, probably pretty well taken care of so that they would be ready and pretty if called upon. We just don't know. Thankfully, this kind of thing is not super popular anymore, so I think that's probably a good thing. But Esther's big night arrives, and it says that she doesn't decide what to wear, what to bring, what to do. She asks Hegai, who is the king's eunuch, the guy who's kind of in charge of the girls on this side of the contest. He seems to know the king well. He's got inside information. She's like, can you give me some tips? Can you give me an inside track? Which he gives her because he had favored her. She does what he suggests in order to win the king's affection. And what do you know? Esther, the secretly Jewish cousin/daughter of Mordecai, wins the whole competition. In one night, she goes from being a virtual nobody, it seems, to being the queen of Persia. And the king, it seems to be a bit of a pattern with him, has another big party, right? Declares a holiday and tax breaks and gives presents and all of that. It's Esther Day. Let's break out the wine. They have a big celebration. Again, the actions of King Xerxes are not presented as, well, this is noble and this is what we should emulate. It is just what the king of Persia does. But what we see clearly is that a series of very unlikely events has taken place. Like, what are the odds that Esther would win? Well, technically we don't know. Some of the math brains out there are like, well, they would essentially be 1 over X, where X is the number of girls in the competition, barring any other factors, right? We don't know. We don't know how many girls there were. The implication is that if they knew she was Jewish and or that her real name was Myrtle, she would have been unlikely to win, right? So she did have a disadvantage, but she managed to keep that hidden. But the couple of times, like there's those couple of really, really loaded sentences, right? As soon as she shows up, Hegai, she found favor in his eyes. And then it says, Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. I feel like there should be an asterisk because I doubt the other girls in the beauty contest she was finding favor in their eyes. I just suspect it'd be very, very difficult to not, they say comparison is the thief of joy, ladies, and but I think it'd be difficult. Anyway, all she did was win. Everyone loved this gal, and she ends up on top. It just so happened that she became the queen of the Persian Empire at a time when the clues that were given already, and they are foreshadowing, is that the Jewish people have been asked to go home and they're not super popular at this point, and here she is, queen of the Persian Empire. God is always at work. This book's in the Bible, read through the eyes of faith. It's like, well, it's very clear. God was organizing and orchestrating all of this, right? God is at work in our stories as well. I mean, I don't think you would have to dig very deep in your own memory to think of just how unlikely so many parts of your story are. Even if you're like, I haven't done anything exciting, it's like just the odds of you meeting the people that you've met, surviving the things that you've survived, like there are where it's like that, you wouldn't bet on that, right? Sometime when you have several hours, I can tell you about the story how I ended up here. It is not, point A to point B, straight line, very predictable, like anyone could have seen that coming. Not so. Very Plinko-esque. Do we see God at work? Or are we more tempted to say that's just the way things go sometimes, right? You win some, you lose some, what do you know? It's a little of both. But God is always at work. For instance, today you're at church. You're at First Baptist Church today. You didn't have to be here. You had excuses, right? It's cold and slippery out there. But here you are. Or you're watching on a computer. Maybe today, maybe sometime in the future. That's weird, right? Hello, future person. Greetings from the past. You're watching this, though. What are the odds of you being here today, really? What are the odds that you would be thinking about the story of Esther after the week, after the month that you've just had? And only you know all the details. And here we're talking about Esther. Right? What are the odds? What might God be doing in your story today? What might it lead to? I think, if anything, we are encouraged as we read this story to have eyes to look for and trust that God is always working in our circumstances. Let me pray for us. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your love for us. And we thank you that we can trust you because you are utterly wise and utterly good, and you're able to do anything. As the saying goes, you work in mysterious ways because we can't trace all of the things that you do. You have ways and means at your disposal that we can't even imagine. You have a perspective that is so far above us. We choose to trust you. Lord, I pray for all of us here today, because some of us are facing bits in our story that are not great. We don't feel like Esther who just won the lottery. We feel maybe like Esther who just got dragged from her home and sent to the palace. Maybe things are not looking the way we would pick in our story. But Lord, I pray that you would help us again today, again this week, to trust that even though we can't figure out what you might be doing, where things might be going, it doesn't seem to make sense, it might not even seem fair, that you would give us eyes to see and hearts to trust that you're always at work in our stories. And I pray, Lord, that you would glorify yourself in each of our lives in ways that seem big or small to us, but that ultimately result in glory for you. We pray this in Jesus' name.